Welcome to Africa to You. In the studio today, I'm honored to host Senator James Eldridge. Senator Eldridge is a state senator in Massachusetts, representing the Middlesex and Worcester senatorial district. He has introduced or supported various legislation, including an act on criminal justice reform promoting restorative justice. However, before I engage with the senator, let me first provide an African cultural perspective on restorative justice. In this episode, like many previous episodes, I am presenting African culture from a Pan-African perspective. Historically, in many traditional African societies, individual identities were derived from larger group identities such as clans, tribes, villages, and different social classifications. These groups emphasized rectitude and good behavior, and that influenced their judicial system, which favored harmony among the people. Disputes were mainly settled between individuals. I'm careful not to present Africa as one homogeneous community, cognizant of the fact that the continent is often misrepresented, as one big country with one culture. However, I can safely say that Africans are extremely involved in the social life of their communities, a trend that is very evident among African immigrants in the United States who replicate African communities, form clusters of vibrant groups of people, and exhibit a strong sense of community. Historically, the communities have been involved in the decentralized justice processes. The traditional authority systems encourage the community to take an active role in resolving the conflicts and fixing the harm done. It is common for the people to approach justice through a restorative lens by making the victim central and focusing on their needs and how they can be met while maintaining the unity of the community, clan, or village. In the past, it was normal to witness ritual feasting as the outcome of a process of reconciliation. This is possibly due to the fact that in many African societies, neighbors, relatives, and friends depended on each other. They raised each other's children, harvested on each other's farms, contributed to each other's social events, and so it was only natural that they resolved conflicts together through neighborhood courts. They focused on resolving conflicts through mediation as opposed to pronouncing judgment, characteristic of their strong sense of community. The approach to these cases was to involve dialogue in the community, which we would call mediation and adjudication, promote individual and societal healing through reconciliation. This sometimes ended with a meal or feast to confirm the start of the reconciliation process. And it also emphasized harm and resulting obligations. The victim's needs were kept central, and it encouraged offenders to understand and take responsibility for harm. Despite the weakening of the pre-colonial indigenous restorative justice mechanisms by colonization, it is still evident to date. For example, my mother was, until recently, a chairperson of the local council, a village-level administration of the country's very decentralized structure, and when people in our village had disputes within the family or with the neighbors, they came to our house to present their cases, hoping for a dispute resolution and some form of reconciliation. As a family, we offered refreshments or food to the victims and the offender as needed, depending on the timing of their cases at our home. The community I grew up in rarely opted for retributive justice. There were many cases of retributive justice in the African societies too, but today, when we look at the retribution, we agree that it worsens wounds because it separates justice from healing. In modern East Africa, cultural and decentralized restorative forms of justice have played a big role in reconstructing social order in some post-conflict societies in Rwanda, Uganda, South Africa, and others. Rwanda's Gacaca restorative process after the 1994 genocide played a significant role in curbing the retaliatory feeling of those who lost their loved ones. Uganda adopted an agreement on grassroots reconciliation with the former Lord's Resistance Army rebels, and in Acholi it was called Matoput. These are transitional processes of healing from very serious crimes like genocide that have negatively impacted the lives of the people in these communities. Senator Eldridge will be telling us more about the Restorative Justice Act that he has introduced to the Senate and how he hopes it will transform communities in Massachusetts. We will also learn the parallels that it has with African restorative justice processes. Let's take a break, and when we are back, the Senator will be telling us more about his act. Senator, welcome to the show.
Vivian, thank you so much for having me on Africa to You, and it's an honor to be here on the show.
We're honored to have you here. Have you had the opportunity to interact with the African immigrant communities or in your constituencies?
Well, I certainly am more and more. One of the wonderful things I'm seeing in Acton is that I'm seeing more African immigrant families move to Acton, similar to how in the past 10 to 20 years, Asian American and Latino American families have moved here to Acton. So it's become much more of a diverse community than when I grew up in Acton.
You have introduced an act, of course, promoting restorative justice in your constituency. Can you tell us more about the act?
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, I really appreciate your explaining the history of restorative justice in other societies, including African countries and societies, because I think it's important to emphasize that the legislation that I've filed is based on these concepts that have existed for centuries, for millennia, in other other continents, other countries, and other cultures.
Yeah.
I first became familiar with restorative justice when I was a state representative, and there's an organization, a nonprofit in Concord called Communities for Restorative Justice. They work out of the Concord Police Department, and they began working with communities, including Acton and Concord, for people that were often arrested for their first offense, often those who were young, say shoplifting or destroying property or smashing a mailbox. And instead of them going through the court process and getting a record that could prevent them from going to college or getting a job, they were diverted to a restorative justice process where they had to face the persons or property owners they harmed. The police was involved, members of the community, and often the parents of the responsible party. And they would have literally a circle of restorative justice to talk about that harm, to talk about how to repair that harm, and if that moved forward, the person would not get a criminal record for the harm they caused.
Yeah, I have been, previously when I was in Hawaii, I worked with the Office of the Prosecuting Attorney's Office, and they had somebody in charge of restorative justice within the office.
That's fantastic.
It is, but also I have continued to learn that as a trend, when children, you talked about children who have minor offenses, when they are exposed to the criminal justice system, then the chances of them getting back into in jail at a later age are higher.
Absolutely.
And that has been one of the things that the proponents of restorative justice have pointed out, especially if we are to have a future generation of people who learn the art of negotiation, reconciliation, and also taking responsibility of the actions that they have done. And so, are you familiar with the African indigenous or current restorative justice processes? And if so, are there parallels with the legislation you introduced?
I'm not that familiar with it, although I have read a little bit about the Reconciliation Commission that happened after the end of apartheid in South Africa, to have that process of the black South Africans who were discriminated against and had their lives destroyed. So I've learned about that commission, but I don't know about other practices in Africa.
Yeah, and the other, like I mentioned earlier in the introduction, Hawaii had an indigenous process called the Ho'oponopono. And there are also Native American circles in America, and there are Ifoga in Samoa, and Maori family conferencing in New Zealand. So this is just to show that the restorative processes are indigenous in many parts of the world, but and they are a good alternative to punitive justice processes. But have there been any lessons learned from the processes you've been exposed to that are not, whether they are American or out of America? What are the lessons you're drawing from these processes?
Yeah, well, I would say certainly, and just to highlight what's happened at the State House recently, is that the House and Senate passed a criminal justice reform bill, and added to that bill was the restorative justice legislation that Representative Sean Garbely and I filed. Okay. So I think it's highly likely that restorative justice will become the law of the state, and that will allow it to be an option for any police department or prosecutor across Massachusetts. If it does become law, then it's really an opportunity, I think, for restorative justice advocates, lawmakers, those involved in the judicial system to learn more about the history of restorative justice, including in African societies and cultures, and take those lessons and apply them across Massachusetts. So I think we have a lot to learn, and this is really just the beginning point for something that's existed for centuries and millennia.
Right. Why is restorative justice important to you, and why should it be an option in the justice system reform in Massachusetts?
Well, I think what we've really seen for, I'd say arguably the past 40 to 50 years in Massachusetts and across the country is a punishment approach to people who break the law. Right. Whether you're talking about people who suffer from drug addiction, to the elements of poverty, to issues of people having anger issues, or perhaps not being raised in a very supportive family, is that's what has caused so much crime. And if we just have a punishment approach of locking people up in jail, that's not going to address the root cause of crime, and it's also not going to create healing for the victims. And I think that's one of the powerful things about restorative justice that we've heard from the program that exists in Middlesex District Attorney Marion Ryan's office, is that the people that have been harmed by their mailbox being smashed or their property being defaced, is that they actually appreciate and have a greater reparation, if you will, from the responsible party apologizing to them than seeing that person go to jail or getting a fine. Right. So I think the idea now is, if this does become law, it'll reduce people going to jail. It'll also create more of a dialogue in communities between those who commit a crime and those that are hurt by it, and therefore, from a bigger picture point of view, reduce sort of the mass incarceration punishment model that not only is destructive to so many families, but also, we're spending literally hundreds of millions of dollars in our jails.
Right. Does the act you introduced have exceptions for when restorative justice cannot be applied? And if so, what are those exceptions?
Yes, there are exceptions around certain aspects of domestic violence. Right. And the acts of murder. So there are exceptions, but pretty much every other crime, it would be an option. I want to emphasize that the victims would have to agree for a case to be diverted to restorative justice, and it's at the discretion of prosecutors and police chiefs. I want to commend, here in Acton, the Acton Police Chief has been very supportive of restorative justice and was one of the first communities to initiate restorative justice.
Right. What is the experience with the school systems in Acton or Massachusetts when it comes to crimes within the school among the students? Is there some kind of restorative justice process within the schools?
Most school districts there isn't. I know in Cambridge, in the Cambridge Public Schools, they have had restorative justice for many years. There's a amazing restorative justice practitioner named Chandra Banks, who does terrific work there. Right. But I would say that unfortunately many school districts, someone that commits a minor offense, the immediate reaction is to go to the police, to have that person be charged with a crime, And although that might be appropriate in some circumstances,
Right.
I think in a lot of instances, there's too much of a sort of prosecution model, and I think
Yes.
we need to really move away from that.
Yeah, the reason I ask is because, kids will have what the common people say. I mean, what people usually say is kids will be kids. And sometimes they are acting out of frustrations, whether at home, at school, but they don't have a way to voice their frustrations. And sometimes it translates into acts that might hurt others. And so if a child does something wrong, in the past, at least there would be, at least in my culture, when you did something wrong, you went to the principal's office and you had the talk or something like that, and then they found a way to remedy whatever you had done, and you get back to school, as opposed to just suspending you and expelling you with every little offense. So because there are effects of suspension, or the kid feels rejected, and they might
Absolutely.
start hating school, and so I was just concerned and wondering what the process is in the schools here in Massachusetts, being a mother of young children.
Yeah, and then we hope that if restorative justice becomes law in sort of the courts, is that the next phase is bringing it into the school system. Because you're right, it has a very negative effect if you're 14, 15, 16, and suddenly you're being charged with a crime for a relatively minor offense.
Right.
And we call that often the school to prison pipeline. Is that, are we setting up young people that might have made a mistake in their lives to a path of ending up in prison? And that's deeply disturbing, and we need to reverse that.
Right. Are there groups in this community that are supporting restorative justice that you're working with, beside the CRJ?
C4RJ.
C4RJ.
Yes, there are a number of organizations, including there's a coalition on restorative justice. And there are groups like certain criminal justice reform groups like the Harm Reduction Drug Law Reform Caucus that have listed this as a priority.
Okay.
I think to some extent restorative justice has been a little bit under the radar because we've been looking at bigger pieces of legislation like repealing mandatory minimums for nonviolent drug offenses, solitary confinement in the prisons, and juvenile justice. But I think that the focus on restorative justice is growing. Obviously, I'm hoping this show today will further highlight it.
I hope so. Because is there any specific message you'd like to give to your constituents about restorative justice, and any other, or even to African immigrants who I represent in a way? Is there any message you'd like to give?
Yeah, well, on the restorative justice front, we're really encouraging people to reach out to your police chiefs, reach out to your elected officials and say, restorative justice should now be practiced in the community, whether in the police department or the district attorney's office that represents the town, or as you suggested in the school district. So I represent 14 communities. 8 of those communities now are involved in restorative justice. But what we're working on now is that I represent 4 Worcester County communities, Harvard, Westboro, Northborough, Southborough. The Worcester District Attorney's Office does not yet practice restorative justice, so we're really trying to encourage District Attorney Joe Early to adopt restorative justice in his office, sort of like you mentioned when you worked in Hawaii, the prosecutor's office had a division within the office.
Yes.
So we're really hoping to do that because Middlesex District Attorney Marion Ryan has really been the leader on restorative justice, but now we want to expand it statewide.
That'll be awesome. What are some of the resistances to restorative justice that you have experienced, and why is there some kind of resistance?
Yeah, I think in American society and in politics for far too long, there's been a lock a person up and throw away the key, model towards combating crime.
Right.
There's a theory that just by putting more and more people in jail will reduce the crime rate. But the crime rate in America, including in Massachusetts, is very low, and I don't think it has anything to do with people locked up in jail. It usually has to do with the economy and the social safety net. And so we really need to push more prosecutors to move away from a model of just prosecuting people and to using more alternatives, including restorative justice.
Okay.
I think you had asked also in your 2-part question about, what I would say to African, immigrants or immigrant families. And I would really say that, first of all, as I mentioned, I'm really seeing an increase in African immigrants and families in the district I represent, which is great. I've also seen that, as whether as a result of that or just the sort of national dialogue, there's been specific incidents of racism, and I think that's unacceptable. It's happened in the Acton-Boxborough schools recently.
Oh.
So reaching out to police chiefs, reaching out to school committee, boards of selectmen, and your legislator to say that's unacceptable, and we really need to push back and make sure that that doesn't happen and have a zero tolerance policy towards that.
Thank you, Senator, for your time. Thank you for joining me on the show, and we hope that restorative justice can become something more of the norm in Massachusetts and in this country, because as communities, I believe in relationships, so building and maintaining relationships. So we hope that we wish you success in the campaign toward restorative justice in the community, and we hope to have you again on Africa to You, with maybe talking about something else in the community.
Absolutely. Well, Vivian, thank you so much for having me on, and thank you for what you're doing on Acton TV and in your community.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.